Imagine being in the middle of God's great promise, yet caught in the struggle of waiting. Abraham had been told that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, Genesis 15:5. But years went by and nothing happened. No child, no heir. The promise of God seemed suspended in silence, and in the culture of the ancient Near East, where heirs weren't just a blessing but the very foundation of survival, this wasn't simply a matter of patience, it was life or death for the family legacy. Without children, there was no future, no security, no name carried forward. The pressure to act was overwhelming. And it is here, in the tension between divine promise and human impatience, that we encounter one of the most complex and emotional stories in Abraham's journey, the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah, unable to bear children, decided to turn to a solution provided by her culture. In Mesopotamian law codes like the Code of Hammurabi and the Nuzi tablets, we find records of what was considered an acceptable practice. If a wife could not provide an heir, she could give her maidservant to her husband, and the child born from that union would be legally recognized as the wife's. It was a way of preserving lineage when biology failed. So when Sarah says in Genesis 16:2, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her," she was not inventing something new. She was leaning on the cultural wisdom of her day. It made sense on paper. It was even seen as responsible. And Abraham agreed. Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian maidservant, was drawn into this arrangement. She conceived, and for a brief moment, it looked as if the problem had been solved. Genesis 16:4 tells us that once Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise Sarah. Suddenly, the household hierarchy fractured. Who was truly in control now, the barren wife or the pregnant servant? Sarah, once desperate for a child, now felt threatened by the very woman she had chosen. Jealousy festered, conflict erupted, and in her bitterness, Sarah mistreated Hagar so severely that Hagar fled into the wilderness. Alone and pregnant, a servant woman cast out into the desert had no future. In the harsh world of the ancient Near East, survival was tethered to family and protection. A woman without either was as good as dead. Yet, Genesis 16:7 records something extraordinary. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. This is the very first time in Scripture that an angel of the Lord appears, and it is not to Abraham, the patriarch, but to Hagar, the servant. God breaks into history not in the tent of the great man, but in the wilderness with a marginalized woman. The angel reassured her, told her to return, and promised her descendants too numerous to count. He told her to name her son Ishmael, which means God hears, because the Lord had heard her misery, Genesis 16:11. And here, Hagar does something no one else in Scripture had yet done. She gives God a name. Overwhelmed by his presence, she declares, "You are El Roi," which means the God who sees, Genesis 16:13. In a world that treated her as invisible, disposable, and voiceless, God both heard and saw her. The laws of her time offered no protection, but the God of Abraham gave her dignity. Years passed. Ishmael grew, and then came the miracle no one expected. Sarah, well past the age of childbearing, gave birth to Isaac, the son of promise, Genesis 21:2. The household, already fragile, now teetered on the edge of chaos. Genesis 21:9 records that Sarah saw Ishmael mocking, and whether this was playful teasing or serious rivalry, Sarah's response was fierce. She demanded that Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael, saying, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21:10. This demand may sound harsh, but in the context of the time, It followed the strict concern for inheritance rights. Sarah wanted no competition for Isaac's position as heir. Abraham was deeply distressed, for Ishmael was his son too. But God spoke to Abraham and told him to listen to Sarah, for Isaac was the chosen line of covenant. At the same time, God promised Abraham that Ishmael would not be forgotten. He too would become the father of a great nation. Genesis 21:13. So Abraham, torn between duty and heartbreak, sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness with only bread and water. When the provisions ran out, the story reaches one of its most heartbreaking moments. Genesis 21:15-16 describes how Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush and sat a distance away, saying, "I cannot watch the boy die." Her cries and the cries of her son rose into the silence of the desert, and once again, God responded. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. Lift him up, for I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 21:17-18. God opened her eyes to a well of water, and their lives were spared. Ishmael grew, became strong, and eventually the father of many. This raises profound questions. Why was Isaac chosen for the covenant, and not Ishmael? Why would God allow such pain and division in Abraham's family? The answer lies in the mystery of God's plan. The covenant had to flow through Isaac because it was through him that God would ultimately bring forth the Messiah. The promise was never about favoritism. It was about a pathway of redemption. Yet, Ishmael was not abandoned. His story shows that while God's covenant follows one line, his compassion extends to all. Ishmael's very name is a testimony that God hears, and Hagar's declaration is a testimony that God sees. The ancient Near Eastern backdrop makes this even more striking. In their legal systems, the powerless were expendable. Servants, foreigners, and women outside of marriage structures had little to no rights. But the God of Abraham stood apart. He intervened where no law would. He affirmed dignity where society offered none. He met a servant in the desert and wrote her name into his story. In doing so, he revealed something about his character that still echoes today. He is not only the God of patriarchs and kings, but also of servants and exiles. And let's not miss the warning for those who are waiting on God's promises. Sarah and Abraham tried to force God's hand by using cultural shortcuts. The result was conflict, jealousy, and pain. Yet God's mercy worked even through their mistakes. How often do we, impatient with God's timing, look for shortcuts of our own? We lean on what culture tells us is practical or wise. But God's promises cannot be manufactured by human solutions. They arrive in His time, and when they do, they bring joy far greater than anything we could construct on our own. As we walk through Abraham's story, this chapter reminds us that faith is rarely neat. It is filled with delays, doubts, and detours. Yet, in the middle of all that, God's faithfulness holds steady. He gave Isaac, the child of promise, but he also blessed Ishmael, the child of struggle. Both were heard, both were seen, and both remind us that the God of Abraham is a God of justice and mercy. So what do we learn here? We learn that impatience can create conflict, but God's mercy can redeem even our mistakes. We learn that cultural norms may provide temporary fixes, but God's ways are higher. And most of all, we learn that no one, no matter how small, marginalized, or cast aside, is invisible to God. He is El Roi, the God who sees. And in a world where so many voices go unheard, that truth changes everything.